The Arizona hills stretched out like ancient sleeping beasts, their backs turned golden in the late afternoon sun. Summer was fading and the air carried the first whispers of autumn, crisp, clean, and tinged with the scent of pine and dust. In these hills, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional call of birds and the soft rustle of wind through the sparse trees. Mason Reed moved like a shadow through the underbrush, his weathered boots making no sound on the forest floor. Sweat beaded on his forehead beneath the brim of his worn hat, but his breathing remained steady, controlled. 12 years in these hills had taught him patience. The deer he'd been tracking for the past hour had stopped to graze in a small clearing ahead, unaware of his presence. Mason raised his rifle slowly, squinting down the barrel. One clean shot was all he needed. In the stillness, he could hear his own heartbeat. Then a gunshot cracked the air. Not his. The deer bolted, vanishing into the trees. Mason tensed, lowering his rifle slightly. The shot had come from the east, maybe half a mile away. He waited, listening. A woman's scream tore through the silence. Mason didn't hesitate. Something deep and instinctual, something he thought he'd buried years ago, propelled him forward. He moved through the trees with the fluid grace of a man who knew these woods like the lines on his own palm, heading toward the sound. Another shot, closer now. Mason crested a small ridge and dropped to one knee, scanning the landscape below. There, a flash of white against the red-brown earth. A woman, her clothes torn to rags, running desperately through a dried creek bed. Behind her, 3 men on horseback, closing fast. Mason's jaw tightened. He didn't need to know the story to recognize a hunt when he saw one. Without thinking, he raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The horsemen reined in, hard heads swiveling toward the ridge where Mason stood. The woman stumbled, looking up with wild, terrified eyes before collapsing to her knees in exhaustion. Mason descended the ridge with deliberate steps, rifle held ready, but not aimed. As he drew closer, he could see the woman more clearly. Young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair matted against her face. Her simple white dress was torn and filthy, and her feet were bare, bloody from the rough terrain. "This doesn't concern you, mister," called one of the horsemen, a burly man with a thick mustache and a city dweller's clothes that seemed out of place in the wilderness. "We're just retrieving some property." Mason stopped, positioning himself between the fallen woman and the riders. "Folks don't usually chase property with guns," he said, his voice low and graveled from disuse. "Not in these hills." "She's a runaway," said the leader, his hand resting too casually near his holstered pistol. "Stole something valuable. Her employer wants her back." Mason glanced back at the woman. She had managed to sit up, clutching a piece of white cloth to her chest. Her eyes met his, filled with desperation and something else, defiance. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't." The leader of the horsemen spat into the dust. "Step aside, old man. This ain't your fight." Mason didn't move. 12 years of solitude had taught him to avoid other people's troubles. 12 years of nightmares had taught him the cost of getting involved. But something in the woman's eyes, something that reminded him of another woman long ago, kept his boots planted firmly in the Arizona dust. "I reckon it is now," he said. The leader's face darkened. He nodded to his companions. "Remember him. We'll be back." He turned his horse with a sharp jerk of the reins. "And you," he called to the woman, "the longer you run, the worse it'll be when we catch you." Mason stood motionless, watching as the 3 riders departed, disappearing over a rise in the direction of Eagle Crest, the mining settlement 10 miles to the west. When they were gone, he turned to the woman. She had slumped forward, her strength finally giving out. As Mason knelt beside her, he saw that the back of her dress was torn open, revealing a network of fresh welts and old scars. And something else, symbols, letter, brands burned and carved into her flesh. One in particular caught his eye, a familiar insignia, the badge of the 18th Tennessee Regiment of the Confederate Army. Mason's stomach turned at the sight, old memories threatening to surface. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open, to fix on Mason with feverish intensity. "Please," she repeated, her fingers gripping the cloth against her chest like it was her last connection to life itself. "Don't take it." "I won't," Mason assured her, his voice gentler than before. "Can you walk?" She tried to stand but swayed dangerously. Without another word, Mason scooped her up in his arms as carefully as if she were made of glass. She was light, too light, and burning with fever. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he began the long walk back to his cabin. The sun was setting by the time the familiar outline of Mason's home appeared among the pines. It was a simple structure, built by his own hands from the timber that grew on these hills. A porch wrapped around 2 sides and a stone chimney rose from the sloped roof. It wasn't much, but it had been his sanctuary for 12 years. Mason pushed the door open with his foot and carried the woman inside. The cabin was neat and sparsely furnished, a table and 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with books and jars, and a narrow bed against the far wall. He laid her down gently on the bed, then moved to light the oil lamp on the table, casting the room in a warm amber glow. The woman remained unconscious, her breathing shallow. Mason gathered clean cloths, a basin of water, and the few medical supplies he kept on hand. As he began to clean her wounds, he was careful to keep the white cloth she clutched covered with a blanket, respecting her desperate plea. Hours passed. Mason worked methodically, cleaning each wound, applying salve where he could. The marks on her back told a story of prolonged cruelty, not just punishment, but systematic torture. He had seen such things during the war, but never on a civilian, never on a woman. When he reached for a particularly deep gash near her shoulder, the cloth she held shifted, revealing a corner of what looked like paper sewn into its lining. A single line of text was visible: Eagle Crest Mine, 187 souls. Mason frowned but did not investigate further. Everyone had their secrets in these hills. He of all people understood that. As night deepened, he built a fire in the stove, brewed coffee, and settled into the chair beside the bed to keep watch. The woman's fever seemed to break sometime after midnight. Her eyes opened briefly, darting around the unfamiliar surroundings before finding Mason's face. "You're safe," he told her simply. "Rest." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether to believe him. Then with a small nod, she closed her eyes again. Mason remained in the chair until dawn, dozing fitfully, old nightmares mixing with new concerns. When first light filtered through the cabin's small windows, he rose stiffly and went to check on his patient. The woman was awake, watching him with wary eyes. Some of the fear had left her face, replaced by cautious assessment. She had pulled herself up to sit against the wall, the white cloth still clutched protectively to her chest. "Water," Mason offered, holding out a tin cup. After a moment's hesitation, she reached for it with a trembling hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. Mason nodded and turned to the stove, giving her space. "I've got coffee brewing and some oats for breakfast if you think you can keep it down." "Why are you helping me?" The question was direct, her tone guarded. Mason paused, considering. It was a fair question, one he'd asked himself during the long night. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he finally said, knowing it wasn't the whole truth, but unable to articulate the rest. "Those men will come back." "Probably." Mason poured coffee into 2 mugs. "But they won't find you easy to take." She accepted the mug he offered, warming her hands around it. "You don't know what you're getting involved in." "No," Mason agreed, "I don't." He pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat, meeting her gaze directly. "My name's Mason Reed. This is my cabin. You're welcome to stay until you're healed up, or longer if you need. I don't ask questions that aren't mine to ask." The woman took a sip of coffee, then looked down into the dark liquid, as if it might contain answers. "Eleanor," she finally said. "Eleanor Hayes, but most people call me Nell." Mason nodded, accepting the introduction without pressing for more. "There's a creek about 50 yards behind the cabin. Water's clean. I can heat some for you to wash up if you'd like." "I would, thank you." They fell into silence, sipping their coffee as the morning light strengthened. Mason was not a man accustomed to company, and conversation did not come easily after so many years alone. But there was something about the quiet way Nell watched him assessing that made him think she understood more than most about the value of silence. Later, after providing Nell with hot water soap and some clean clothes that hung too large on her thin frame, Mason stepped out onto the porch to give her privacy. He stood at the railing, gazing out at the hills that had been his only companions for so long. The encounter with the horsemen troubled him. Not because he feared them, he had faced far worse in his time, but because it meant the world he'd left behind had found its way to his doorstep once again. The insignia he'd seen on Nell's back was no coincidence. The 18th Tennessee had been the regiment responsible for the massacre at Willow Creek, where Mason cut the thought short, unwilling to revisit that particular nightmare in the light of day. But the connection was there, undeniable. After 12 years of running from his past, it seemed his past had finally caught up with him. A soft sound behind him announced Nell's presence. She stepped onto the porch, moving gingerly, the oversized shirt and trousers, making her appear even more fragile. Her dark hair, now clean and damp, hung in waves past her shoulders. The white cloth was still in her hands, folded neatly. "The clothes were my wife's," Mason said, answering the unasked question. "She was taller than you." Nell's eyes widened slightly at this personal revelation. "Where is she now?" "Buried in Tennessee." Mason's tone made it clear he wouldn't elaborate further. Nell nodded, respecting the boundary. She moved to stand beside him at the railing, her gaze taking in the rugged landscape. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "Peaceful. That's why I chose it." "How long have you been here?" 12 years. Mason studied her profile, noting the way her shoulders remained tense despite her apparent calm. "You're not safe standing out in the open like this." A bitter smile touched her lips. "I haven't been safe in a very long time, Mr. Reed." "Mason," he corrected. "Mason," she echoed, testing the name. "You risked your life for a stranger yesterday. I owe you an explanation at least." He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." Nell turned to face him fully. "Those men work for Clayton Mercer. He owns the Eagle Crest Mining Company and most of the town that surrounds it. But what people don't see, what they don't want to see, is that behind the legitimate business is a forced labor camp. Men, women, even children working in conditions that—" Her voice faltered. "I've seen the marks," Mason said quietly. Nell's hand unconsciously moved to her shoulder, where the worst of the scars lay. "They're not just for punishment. They're for identification. Each worker is marked with symbols that show which section they belong to, who their overseer is. The brands make it easier to identify runaways." "And the insignia, the 18th Tennessee." A shadow crossed Nell's face. Mercer was a colonel in the Confederate Army during the war. The 18th was his regiment. He's proud of his history, make sure everyone knows it. Mason's jaw tightened. So his suspicion had been correct. How many times have you tried to escape? This is the third. Nell's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. The first time they broke my nose and locked me in the box for 3 days. The second, she trailed off, her eyes distant. The second time was worse. This time they'll kill me if they find me. Why, what's different? Nell hesitated, then carefully unfolded the white cloth in her hands. Inside, sewn into the lining, was a folded piece of paper. Because of the us, she said, revealing a torn page covered in cramped handwriting, names, dates, numbers. It's part of Mercer's ledger. The real one, not the sanitized version he shows to government inspectors. It lists every person in the camp, where they came from, how they were acquired. Mason studied the document, his expression grim. At the top of the page were the words she had glimpsed earlier: Eagle Crest Mine, 187 souls. There are more pages, Nell continued, locked in Mercer's office at the main mine. This alone isn't enough proof to shut him down, but it's enough to get someone asking questions. That's why they want me back so badly. Not just because I ran, but because I took this. Mason handed the document back to her. You're planning to get the rest. It wasn't a question, but Nell answered anyway. I have to, not just for myself, but for all of them. Her eyes met his fierce despite her weakened state. I know you don't want trouble. I'll leave as soon as I'm able. Mason was silent for a long moment, looking out at the hills that had been his refuge for so long. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to let her go, to return to the solitude he'd built his life around. But the insignia of the 18th Tennessee burned in his mind, linking past to present in a way that felt like fate. No, he finally said. You'll stay, at least until we figure out what to do. Nell looked at him in surprise. We... Before Mason could respond, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. A figure on horseback approaching from the eastern trail. Mason tensed, reaching instinctively for the rifle he'd left inside. Get in the cabin, he ordered, his voice low. Nell obeyed without question, slipping through the door. Mason remained on the porch, his hand resting on the railing, near a hidden knife he kept wedged in the wood. The rider came into clear view, a tall man with copper skin and long black hair pulled back at the nape of his neck. He wore a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and Western attire: buckskin pants, a blue cotton shirt, and moccasins instead of boots. When he saw Mason, he raised a hand in greeting. Mason relaxed slightly. Thomas, he called. Thomas Running Elk guided his horse to the front of the cabin and dismounted with fluid grace. Mason, he replied, his deep voice carrying easily across the clearing. Been a while. 3 months, Mason agreed, stepping down from the porch to meet his friend. Thomas glanced at the cabin, then back to Mason, a knowing look in his dark eyes. I see you have company. News travels fast. Always does. Thomas led his horse to the water trough beside the cabin. Mercer's men are combing the hills, saying they are looking for a thief who stole from the mine office. Is that so? Thomas nodded, his expression serious. They've got more than the usual number out searching, offering a reward too, $50 for information leading to her capture. Mason frowned. $50 was a month's wages for most working men in the territory. How'd you know she was here? A hint of amusement touched Thomas's lips. 12 years in these hills, and you still think I can't read sign? Wow. You carried someone from the eastern ridge. The tracks weren't hard to follow. Anyone else notice? No, I made sure of it. Thomas lowered his voice. But that's not the only reason I came. There's word that Mercer's planning to shut down the main operation, moving everything deeper into the territory away from prying eyes. Mason's brow furrowed. When 7 days, federal inspectors scheduled to arrive next week. Mercer got tipped off. Thomas glanced again at the cabin. If she's planning anything, it needs to happen before then. Once they move, those people disappear forever. The door of the cabin creaked open, and Nell stepped out, her stance wary but determined. I heard, she said simply. Thomas studied her with careful eyes. You're the one they're hunting. Yes, Nell straightened despite the obvious pain it caused her. I'm Eleanor Hayes. Thomas inclined his head slightly. Thomas Running Elk. I'm a friend of Mason's. His only friend from what I can tell, Nell remarked, a hint of wry humor breaking through her caution. Thomas's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Mason values his solitude, most days. Mason cleared his throat. Thomas knows these hills better than anyone. His people lived here for generations before the rest of us arrived. My mother was Apache, Thomas explained. My father was a cavalry officer stationed at Fort Whipple. I walk in both worlds, which has its uses. Nell nodded, understanding the implication. Can you help us get into the Manaim? Us. Thomas raised an eyebrow, looking to Mason. Mason met his friend's gaze steadily. The 18th Tennessee, he said simply. Understanding dawned on Thomas's face. He knew enough of Mason's history to recognize its significance. Mercer, he said. Yes. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. There's an old tunnel, he finally said, dug during the first silver rush before Mercer's time. The entrance is hidden in a dry wash about 2 miles from the main compound. Most have forgotten it exists. Does it lead to the offices? Nell asked, hope kindling in her eyes. Close enough, but getting in is one thing. Getting out? Thomas shook his head. Mercer has 30 armed men patrolling the compound at all times. More during shift changes. We have 7 days to figure it out, Mason said. Less if we want to be sure. Nell looked between the two men, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Why are you helping me, both of you? You don't even know me. Thomas glanced at Mason, then back to Nell. I've seen what happens at Eagle Crest. My cousin disappeared 3 years ago. Last month I found his body in a ravine 5 miles from the mine with one of Mercer's brands on his back. Nell's face softened with understanding. I'm sorry. Thomas nodded in acknowledgement. And Mason? He began, then stopped, leaving the explanation to his friend. Mason shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't a man who shared his past easily, even with those he trusted. But Nell deserved to know what she was getting into and with whom. I served in the Union Army during the war, he said, his voice low. Saw things, did things that can't be undone. After I worked with the Freedmen's Bureau in Tennessee, helping former slaves establish new lives. He paused, the memories pushing against the walls he'd built around them. There was a village called Willow Creek. Freed people building something new. I was there when the 18th Tennessee arrived. Nell's breath caught. Mercer's regiment. Mason nodded, his eyes distant. They burned the village. Killed everyone they could find. Men, women, children. His voice grew rough. There was a young woman named Clara. She died in my arms, trying to protect her child. A heavy silence fell over the three of them. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of dust and sage. I couldn't save them then, Mason finally continued. Maybe this is a second chance. Nell studied him, a new understanding in her gaze. What happened to the child, Clara's child? Mason shook his head. I don't know. In the chaos, I looked but never found her. Always hoped she got away somehow. He straightened as if physically pushing the memories back. That was a lifetime ago. Right now we need to focus on Mercer and those people at Eagle Crest. Thomas nodded in agreement. I should go. The longer I stay, the more likely someone notices. He turned to Nell. Rest, heal. You'll need your strength. To Mason he added, I'll be back tomorrow with more information about the tunnel and the patrol schedules. As Thomas mounted his horse, Mason stepped closer. Watch yourself. Mercer's men know you've helped runaways before. Thomas smiled grimly. Let them come looking. The hills have ways of swallowing men whole. With a nod to Nell, he turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, soon disappearing among the trees. Mason and Nell stood in silence, watching until Thomas was gone. The sun had risen high, casting short shadows across the clearing. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the stillness. You should rest, Mason finally said, turning to Nell. Your wounds need time to heal. Nell nodded, but her eyes remained on the path where Thomas had disappeared. 7 days isn't much time. It's enough, Mason assured her, though he wasn't certain himself. Come inside, we'll talk more after you've rested. As they entered the cabin, Mason felt a strange sense of displacement. For 12 years, this small space had been his alone, a fortress against the world and its complications. Now with Nell's presence, something had shifted. The walls seemed less confining, the silence less absolute. He watched as she settled carefully onto the bed, her movements betraying the pain she tried to hide. Despite everything, there was a quiet strength about her that reminded him of another time, another woman. Clara, Nell said softly as if reading his thoughts. You said she died protecting her child. How old was the child? Mason blinked, surprised by the question. Young, maybe 4 or 5 years old. A little girl. Nell nodded, her eyes distant. Thank you for telling me about her, about Willow Creek. It's not a story I tell often. I can see why. Nell arranged the blanket over her legs, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn fabric. We all have stories we'd rather forget. Mason moved to the stove, adding wood to the dying fire. Some stories follow you no matter how far you run. Yes, Nell agreed, a deep sadness in her voice. They do. As Mason prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Nell drifted into an exhausted sleep. He worked quietly, his thoughts turning to the task ahead. Eagle Crest Mine was a fortress in its own right, with armed guards and the backing of corrupt officials. Even with Thomas's help, getting in and out alive would require more than just courage. It would require a miracle. And yet, as he glanced at the sleeping woman, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. For too long, he had existed rather than lived, haunted by the ghosts of Willow Creek and all the other horrors the war had shown him. Now fate had offered a chance at redemption, or perhaps at long last, peace. The afternoon passed quietly. Mason tended to chores around the cabin, keeping one eye on the trail for any sign of Mercer's men. Nell slept deeply, her body desperately needed the rest to heal. When she finally woke, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Mason helped her to the table where a bowl of bean stew waited. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that grows between people who understand that not every moment needs words to fill it. As darkness fell, Mason lit the oil lamp and placed it on the table between them. The warm glow softened the cabin's rough edges, creating a small island of light in the gathering night. "Tell me about the camp," Mason said finally. "How many people are there?" Nell set down her spoon, her appetite apparently satisfied for now. "At last count 187. Men, women, a few children. Most are former slaves or immigrants who were promised good jobs and fair pay. Some are drifters who were in the wrong place at the wrong time." "And you? How did you end up there?" A shadow crossed Nell's face. "I was looking for information. About Willow Creek, about the 18th Tennessee." She hesitated, then met Mason's gaze directly. "About Clara." Mason's hand tightened around his coffee mug. "Why, because," Nell began, but was interrupted by a sound outside, a branch snapping too loud to be wildlife. Mason was on his feet instantly, extinguishing the lamp with a quick breath. He moved to the window, staying to the side as he peered out into the darkness. Nell remained at the table perfectly still, her eyes wide. "What is it?" she whispered. Mason raised a finger to his lips, listening intently. The night had gone silent, no insects, no night birds. Something or someone had disturbed the natural rhythm of the forest. He reached for his rifle propped beside the door and checked that it was loaded. "Stay here," he murmured. "If anything happens, there's a trap door under the rug. Root cellar, hide there." Before Nell could respond, Mason slipped outside, moving like a shadow across the porch and down the steps. The night air was cool against his skin, carrying the scent of pine and something else, tobacco smoke. Someone was nearby watching. Mason circled the cabin, keeping to the deepest shadows, his rifle held ready. Years of solitude had sharpened his senses, made him attuned to the smallest disruptions in his domain. There a darker shadow among the pines at the edge of the clearing. The ember of a cigarette glowed briefly, then was quickly extinguished. Moving silently, Mason approached from behind, using the trees for cover. The figure was crouched at the forest edge, a spyglass trained on the darkened cabin. Mason could make out the silhouette of a wide-brimmed hat and the outline of a pistol at the man's hip. One of Mercer's scouts, no doubt, sent to confirm Nell's location before the others returned in force. Mason raised his rifle but hesitated. A gunshot would alert any others who might be nearby. Instead, he set the rifle carefully against a tree and drew the hunting knife from his belt. 3 more silent steps brought him directly behind the crouching figure. In one fluid motion, Mason clamped a hand over the man's mouth and pressed the knife to his throat. "Don't move," he whispered into the scout's ear. "Don't make a sound." The man froze, his body rigid with fear. Mason could feel his pulse racing beneath the blade. "I'm going to ask questions. You're going to nod or shake your head. Understand?" A slight nod. "Are you alone?" Another nod. "Here to find the woman." Nod. More men coming. A pause, then a reluctant nod. When the man couldn't answer this with a gesture, Mason eased the pressure on his mouth slightly, keeping the knife firmly in place. "Whisper," he warned. "Dawn," the scout rasped. "Blackwood's bringing 6 men. Said to confirm she was here first." "Blackwood." "Mercer's foreman, the one who marks them." Mason's jaw tightened. "Does Mercer know where she is?" "Not for certain, but he knows someone helped her. Figured it might be you living out here all isolated." "Why me specifically?" The scout swallowed nervously, the movement pressing his throat against the knife edge. "Don't know. Blackwood just said Mercer had a special interest in you. Said you two had history." So Mercer remembered him. After all these years, the connection to Willow Creek remained. "Please," the scout whispered. "I'm just doing got a family to feed. A job that involves hunting people like animals. I don't work the mine, just scout for them sometimes when they need extra eyes." Mason considered his options. Killing the man would buy them time, but it would also confirm their location once he failed to report back. Letting him go meant certain attack at dawn. "Listen carefully," Mason said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to leave these hills tonight. You're going to tell Blackwood that you searched this area and found nothing. The woman must have gone north toward the territorial border. Understand?" The scout nodded vigorously. "If I see you or any of Mercer's men within 5 miles of this cabin again, I won't be so merciful. And believe me, I'll know if you're near." "I understand," the scout whispered. "I swear." Mason removed the knife but maintained his grip on the man. "Go. Now, don't look back." He released the scout, who stumbled forward, gasping. Without a backward glance, the man hurried into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. Mason retrieved his rifle and made his way back to the cabin. Nell was waiting at the door, a kitchen knife clutched in her trembling hand. Relief flooded her face when she recognized him. "What happened?" she asked as he stepped inside. "I heard voices." Mason secured the door behind him and moved to light the lamp again. "Scout," he explained, setting his rifle aside. "Checking if you were here before they bring more men at dawn." Nell's face paled. "Did you?" "No, sent him off with false information, but it won't fool them for long." Mason ran a hand through his graying hair. "We need to move, tonight." "Where?" "I have a place, higher up in the hills. Old trapper's cabin I found years ago. Fixed it up as a shelter for winter hunting trips." Mason was already moving around the cabin, gathering essentials, ammunition, food, medical supplies. Nell rose from her chair, wincing at the pain, but determined to help. How far? 4 miles. Rough terrain. Mason glanced at her, concern evident in his eyes. Can you make it? Nell straightened a fierce resolve, replacing the fear on her face. I'll make it. Mason nodded, respecting her determination. Pack light, only what we absolutely need. As they prepared for the journey, Mason felt a familiar tension building in his chest, the anticipation of conflict, the knowledge that blood would likely be spilled before this was over. For 12 years, he had avoided violence, had built a life around solitude and simplicity. Now, in the space of a day, he had committed himself to a path that could only end in confrontation. And yet, watching Nell carefully fold her precious document into a small pouch, he knew he couldn't have chosen differently. Some fights found you no matter how far you ran. Within an hour, they were ready. Mason extinguished all signs of life in the cabin, making it appear as if no one had been there for days. He led Nell out the back into the darkness of the forest, following a narrow trail that wound upward into the hills. The night was clear, the stars providing just enough light to navigate by. Mason set a careful pace, mindful of Nell's injuries, stopping frequently to let her rest. She never complained, though he could see the pain etched in the tight lines around her mouth. We're being followed, aren't we? She asked during one such rest, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason, who had been listening to the night sounds, nodded. The scout didn't believe me, or didn't trust his chances against Blackwood if he returned empty-handed. How many? Just him for now, but he'll signal the others at first light. Nell's hand went to the pouch at her waist where the document was stored. If they catch us. They won't. Mason interrupted, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Come, we're nearly there. They continued upward of the trail, growing steeper, more challenging. Mason helped Nell over the rough spots, impressed by her resilience despite her weakened state. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, they reached a small plateau nestled between two rocky outcroppings. The trapper's cabin was little more than a sturdy shack built against the lee of a cliff for protection from the wind. Its weathered logs had turned silver with age, making it nearly invisible against the surrounding stone. Mason led Nell inside, securing the heavy wooden door behind them. The interior was simple but functional. A stone fireplace, a narrow cot, shelves stocked with preserved food and supplies. Mason quickly built a small fire, keeping it low to minimize smoke. Rest, he told Nell, gesturing to the cot. We're safe for now. I'll keep watch. Nell sank onto the cot, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Wake me if anything happens, she insisted. I will. As Nell drifted into an uneasy sleep, Mason positioned himself by the single window, rifle ready. The first rays of sunlight were touching the distant hills, illuminating the vast, rugged landscape. Somewhere out there, Mercer's men were searching, closing in. And beyond them at Eagle Crest, mine 187 souls waited in darkness, not knowing that their fate now rested in the hands of a broken soldier and a wounded woman. Mason settled in for the long watch, his mind turning to the plan, taking shape in his thoughts. 7 days until Mercer moved his operation. 7 days to infiltrate a heavily guarded compound, retrieve evidence, and somehow free those imprisoned there. It wasn't just a fight for Nell's freedom anymore. It had become something larger, a chance to confront the ghosts that had haunted him since Willow Creek, to finally face the man whose orders had destroyed so many lives. As the sun climbed higher, Mason kept his eyes on the forest below, watching for any sign of pursuit. The day would be long, but for the first time in 12 years, he wasn't simply waiting for time to pass. He had found his purpose again, and this time he wouldn't fail. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Mason divided his time between watching the forest below for signs of pursuit and tending to Nell, whose fever had returned as exhaustion took its toll. The small cabin grew warm as the Arizona sun climbed higher, its heat penetrating the sturdy logs despite the shade of the cliff. By mid-afternoon, Mason had spotted 2 search parties in the distance, small groups of men combing the lower hills with methodical precision. They hadn't yet discovered the trail leading to the trapper's cabin, but it was only a matter of time. These weren't ordinary men. They were hunters accustomed to tracking prey through difficult terrain. Nell stirred on the cot, her eyes opening to find Mason at the window. They're coming, she said. It wasn't a question. Not yet, Mason replied, not turning from his vigil. But they're looking. Nell pushed herself up, wincing at the pain that flared across her back. The wounds had begun to heal, but movement still brought sharp reminders of what she'd endured. How long before they find us? If we're lucky, nightfall. If not... Mason let the thought he hang out unfinished. Nell nodded, understanding the implications. She reached for the water canteen beside the cot and took a careful sip. What then? Mason finally turned to face her, his weathered features set in grim determination. Then we move again. There are caves higher up, places only Thomas and I know about. And after that, we can't keep running forever, Mason. No, he agreed. We can't. A heavy silence filled the cabin, broken only by the occasional crackle from the dying fire. Nell studied Mason's face, noting the lines etched by years of solitude and unspoken pain. Despite having known him for barely a day, she felt a connection, a shared understanding that went beyond words. You've been running for 12 years, she said softly. Since Willow Creek. Mason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not running, hiding. Is there a difference? His eyes met hers, and for a moment the carefully constructed walls behind them seemed to waver. Hiding means you're still fighting, just waiting for the right moment. Running means you've given up entirely. Nell absorbed this distinction, turning it over in her mind. And now, are you still hiding, or are you ready to fight? Before Mason could answer, a distant sound caught his attention, the muffled report of a rifle followed by another. He moved swiftly to the window, peering out with narrowed eyes. What is it? Nell asked, tension evident in her voice. Signals, Mason replied. They found something. The minutes stretched into an hour as Mason maintained his watch, tracking the movements of the search parties through subtle signs, distant shouts carried on the wind, the flash of sunlight on metal birds taking flight from disturbed trees. The hunters were moving in a new direction now, converging on a point to the north. They've lost our trail, Mason finally said, a hint of relief in his voice. Something's drawn them away. Nell joined him at the window, careful to stay back in the shadows. In the valley below, they could see riders moving with purpose, heading away from their location. Thomas, she suggested. Possibly. He knows these hills well enough to leave false trails. As the last of the search parties disappeared from view, Mason allowed himself to relax slightly. He moved to the fireplace and added a few small sticks, building the flames just enough to heat water for coffee. The familiar ritual brought a sense of normalcy to the tense situation. You never answered my question, Nell said, settling onto a rough-hewn stool near the fire. Are you ready to fight? Mason measured coffee grounds into a battered pot with careful precision. I've been fighting ghosts for 12 years, he said quietly. Maybe it's time to face the real enemy. Nell watched him work his movements, efficient and practiced. Mercer, she said. Mercer, Mason confirmed, and men like him who think they can own others, who use power to crush the weak. He placed the pot on the fire. The war was supposed to end that. So many died believing they were fighting for something better. But it didn't end, Nell observed. It just changed forms. Mason nodded, his expression distant. When I found Willow Creek burning, something in me broke. I'd seen terrible things during the war, but this was different. These were families trying to build new lives, children playing in gardens their parents had planted. His voice grew rough with emotion. And Clara, she was barely more than a girl herself, clutching her daughter, begging me to save her child even as she bled out in my arms. Nell's eyes glistened with unshed tears. What happened to the child? I tried to find her in the chaos. Searched for hours, but... Mason shook his head. I never knew if she survived or if Mercer's men took her. It's one of many ghosts that haunt me. The coffee began to bubble, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Mason removed it from the fire and poured 2 cups, handing one to Nell. She accepted it gratefully, warming her hands around the tin mug. I was 5 years old when Willow Creek burned, she said softly. Mason froze his cup halfway to his lips. Something in her tone made his heart stutter in his chest. My mother was helping the other women tend the communal garden. Nell continued, her gaze fixed on the swirling coffee. I was playing nearby with the other children when the riders came. There was so much noise, shouting, gunfire, screaming. My mother grabbed me and ran for the trees. She took a shaky breath. We almost made it, but a bullet caught her in the back. She fell, still holding me. Mason set his cup down, a terrible suspicion forming in his mind. Nell. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. She told me to run, to hide, not to come out, no matter what I heard. Her last words were about you, a Union soldier with kind eyes who would help me if I could find him. A single tear traced its way down her cheek. I hid in a hollow log until nightfall. When I finally came out, the village was gone. Everyone was gone, including you. Mason stared at her, unable to speak as the full implication of her words sank in. Clara, he finally managed. Your mother was Clara. Nell nodded, her eyes never leaving his. I spent years piecing together what happened that day. Found others who survived, learned about the 18th Tennessee, about Colonel Mercer. When I was old enough, I started searching for him and for you. A bitter smile touched her lips. Found Mercer first. That's how I ended up at Eagle Crest. Mason's mind reeled with the revelation. The child he had searched for, the one whose fate had haunted him for 12 years, was sitting before him and now grown alive, and somehow connected to him once more through a twist of fate that defied explanation. I thought, he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. All these years I thought I'd failed her. Failed you. You didn't, Nell said firmly. My mother's last memory was of kindness, a soldier who tried to help when no one else would. She believed in you, even at the end. Mason turned away, overcome. He moved to the window, needing space to process the flood of emotions threatening to drown him. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the hills. The beauty of it seemed at odds with the turmoil within him. I should have found you, he said without turning. Should have looked harder. You couldn't have, Nell replied gently. I was too frightened to call out, even when I heard people searching. By the time I emerged, everyone was gone. What happened to you after? An old freed woman named Hannah found me wandering the next day. She took me in, raised me as her own. When I was 12, she told me everything she knew about Willow Creek, about my mother. Nell's voice softened with memory. Hannah was a good woman. Taught me to read, to think for myself. When she died 5 years ago, I decided it was time to find answers. Mason turned back to face her, his expression transformed by a newfound clarity of purpose. And now you have. Some, Nell acknowledged, but Mercer is still free, still hurting people. The ledger is just the beginning. I want justice for my mother, for everyone at Willow Creek, and for the 187 souls trapped at Eagle Crest. We'll get it, Mason promised, the words carrying the weight of an oath. Together, a sound, outside the soft whistle of a canyon wren repeated 3 times, interrupted the moment. Mason moved instantly to the door, rifle in hand. Thomas, he explained to Nell's questioning look. Moments later, Thomas Running Elk slipped inside, his movements silent, despite his haste. His face was drawn with exhaustion, and a long scratch marked his left cheek. Mercer's men are everywhere, he reported, accepting the cup of water Mason offered. I led them north with false tracks, but they'll figure it out by morning. You're hurt, Nell observed, gesturing to the scratch. Thomas touched it absently. Branch, not bullet. I'm fine. He studied the two of them with keen eyes. Something's changed. Mason glanced at Nell, who nodded slightly, giving permission to share her story. Briefly, Mason explained what he had learned about Nell's identity and her connection to Willow Creek. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When Mason finished, he turned to Nell with newfound respect. The spirits work in mysterious ways, he said, bringing you full circle after so many years. Do you believe in destiny, Thomas? Nell asked. A hint of a smile touched his lips. I believe that nothing in this world happens without purpose. Even the greatest suffering can lead to healing if we're brave enough to face it. Mason cleared his throat, bringing the conversation back to more immediate concerns. What about the mine? Were you able to scout the tunnel? Thomas nodded, his demeanor shifting to one of businesslike efficiency. It's still there, hidden by rockfall at the entrance, but passable once you're inside. I marked the path with white stones. He reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a folded piece of paper. I also made this. Spreading the paper on the small table, Thomas revealed a detailed map of the Eagle Crest compound. He had sketched the layout with remarkable precision. The main shaft processing buildings, barracks for the guards, the long, low structures where the workers were kept, and most importantly, the administrative building where Mercer's office was located. The tunnel comes out here, he explained, pointing to a spot behind a storage shed, 50 yards from the main office. Guards patrol every 15 minutes along this route. His finger traced a path between buildings. Most of the armed men are stationed here, here, and here. He indicated 3 guard posts. Mason studied the map intently, his military training evident in the way he analyzed the tactical situation. What about inside the office? 2 rooms, Thomas replied. Outer office where a clerk works during the day but empty at night. Inner office is Mercer's domain. Safe is behind the desk under a painting of a battle scene. Gettysburg, Nell added. He's proud of having fought there, though his regiment broke and ran during Pickett's charge. The ledger would be in that safe. Can you open it? Mason asked her. A determined smile crossed Nell's face. I worked as Mercer's housemaid for 3 months before he sent me to the mine. I've seen him open it many times. The combination is his wife's birthday, April 18, 1832. Thomas raised an eyebrow, impressed. You were planning this escape for some time. Since the day I arrived, Nell confirmed. I just didn't expect to find Mason in the process. She turned to him. Or to learn that the soldier my mother spoke of had been searching for me all these years. A comfortable silence fell over the cabin as each of them contemplated the strange workings of fate that had brought them together. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice low and urgent. There's something else you should know. While I was near the compound, I overheard Blackwood Mercer's foreman talking to the guards. They're accelerating the timeline. The move is happening in 3 days, not 7. 3 days, Nell's face paled. That's not enough time. It has to be, Mason said firmly. Once they move those people deeper into the territory, we'll never find them again. Thomas nodded in agreement. The federal inspector got delayed in Prescott. Won't arrive for another week. Mercer's taking advantage of the extra time to disappear completely. Mason paced the small confines of the cabin, his mind working through the implications. We need to move fast, but not recklessly. If we fail, those people have no hope. What about the law? Nell asked. Surely the territorial marshal would act if he knew. Thomas and Mustin exchanged knowing glances. Marshal Davis is in Mercer's pocket, Thomas explained gently. Has been for years. Why do you think no one investigates the disappearances around Eagle Crest? Nell's expression hardened with understanding. So we're alone. Not entirely. Mason said, a plan beginning to take shape in his mind. I have a friend, Edgar Sullivan, former Union officer, now sheriff in Yavapai County. He's a good man, incorruptible. If we can get the ledger to him, he'll act regardless of Mercer's connections. Can you reach him in time? Thomas asked. I need to write to him tonight. If you can get the letter to Prescott by tomorrow evening, he could be here with deputies the day after. Thomas considered this, mentally calculating distances and travel times. It's possible. 30 miles to Prescott if I cut across the mountains. Hard riding, but I know the trails. That still leaves us with the problem of getting the ledger, Nell pointed out, and keeping Mercer from moving everyone before Sullivan arrives. Mason returned to the map, studying it with renewed focus. We go tomorrow night, he decided. Just the two of us. He looked up at Thomas. You'll be more valuable delivering the letter and guiding Sullivan back. Thomas nodded, accepting the logic. What's the plan? As night deepened around the small cabin, the three conspirators bent over the map, their voices low and intent, as they formulated a strategy that would either bring justice to Eagle Crest or cost them their lives. The stakes could not have been higher, not just for themselves, but for the 187 souls whose freedom hung in the balance. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Arizona hills. Mason stood on the small clearing outside the trapper's cabin, watching as Thomas mounted his horse for the journey to Prescott. The letter to Sheriff Sullivan was secured inside his jacket, its contents a careful balance of facts and urgency, without revealing too much that could incriminate them if it fell into the wrong hands. Ride safe, Mason said, clasping his friend's arm in farewell. We'll meet you at the rendezvous point in 2 days. Thomas nodded, his expression solemn. May the spirits of your ancestors guide your path, he said, using a traditional Apache blessing. And may they blind the eyes of your enemies. With a final nod to Nell, who stood in the cabin doorway, Thomas turned his horse and disappeared into the morning mist that clung to the higher elevations. Mason watched until he was gone, then turned to Nell. We should rest while we can. Tonight will test us both. They spent the day in quiet preparation, checking and rechecking the few weapons they possessed. Mason's rifle, a revolver Thomas had left with them, and the hunting knife Mason always carried. Nell practiced opening a small box with a similar combination lock to the one she would face in Mercer's office, her fingers growing more confident with each attempt. As the afternoon waned, Mason found himself drawn to the cabin's single window, gazing out at the vast Arizona landscape. The beauty of it still moved him even after 12 years. The rugged hills, the distant mountains, the endless sky. It was a harsh land, unforgiving of weakness, but it offered freedom to those strong enough to embrace its challenges. It's beautiful, isn't it? Nell said, coming to stand beside him. I can see why you chose this place. Mason nodded. After Willow Creek, I couldn't bear to be around people. Their faces reminded me of all those I couldn't save. But the land, it doesn't judge. Doesn't ask questions. Just accepts you as you are. And now, Nell asked softly, after tonight, if we succeed, will you return to your solitude? The question caught Mason off guard. He had been so focused on the immediate task that he hadn't considered what might come after. I don't know, he admitted. For 12 years, this life has been enough. But now you've remembered there's a world beyond these hills, Nell finished for him. Perhaps. Mason turned to her, struck by how different she looked from the desperate, wounded woman he had found just days ago. Though still bearing the physical marks of her captivity, there was a strength in her eyes now, a determination that spoke of resilience beyond her years. What about you? What will you do when this is over? Nell considered the question, her gaze turning distant. I've spent so long looking backward, searching for answers for justice, that I've never really thought about the future. A small smile touched her lips. Maybe that's a gift waiting on the other side of tonight, the chance to look forward instead of back. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they made their final preparations. Both dressed in dark clothing that would blend with the night. Nell bound her hair tightly beneath a cap and darkened her face with ash from the fireplace. Mason checked their weapons one last time, then studied the map Thomas had drawn until he could recall every detail from memory. Remember, he told Nell as they prepared to depart, if anything goes wrong, if we get separated, make for the rendezvous point. Don't wait for me, don't try to help. Just get yourself to safety. I won't leave you behind, Nell said firmly. You might have to, Mason countered, his expression grave. The ledger is what matters. Those people at Eagle Crest are what matter. One life, even mine, isn't worth sacrificing them all. Nell wanted to argue, but recognized the hard truth in his words. The same goes for you, she said instead. If I'm caught, you take the ledger and go. Promise me. After a moment's hesitation, Mason nodded. I promise. They left the cabin as the last light faded from the sky, making their way down the steep trail with careful steps. The moon was just past full, providing enough light to navigate by, but also increasing the risk of detection. They moved in silence, each lost in their own thoughts as they descended toward Eagle Crest. The journey took 3 hours of careful travel through increasingly difficult terrain. As they neared the mining compound, they could see the glow of lanterns illuminating the night guard posts, administrative buildings, and the processing facility that never fully shut down. From their vantage point on a rocky outcropping, they could make out the movements of guards patrolling the perimeter, their rifles glinting occasionally in the moonlight. Mason gestured for Nell to follow him as he led the way to the dry wash Thomas had described. The entrance to the old tunnel was well hidden, just as Thomas had said, marked only by a subtle arrangement of white stones that would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for them. After ensuring they weren't observed, Mason moved the stones aside to reveal a narrow opening, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. He went first, sliding into the darkness with practiced ease, then helped Nell follow. Once inside, they replaced the stones to conceal their entry. The tunnel was low and narrow, forcing them to proceed in a crouched position. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of earth and old timbers. Mason struck a match, its feeble light revealing rough walls supported by wooden beams that had begun to rot with age. Small creatures scurried away from the sudden illumination. "Stay close," Mason whispered, extinguishing the match after memorizing the immediate path. "Follow the wall with your hand. The tunnel runs straight for about 200 yards, then branches. We take the right fork." They moved forward in darkness, the only sounds their careful breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The tunnel seemed to press in around them, a living entity that resented their intrusion. Nell fought against a growing sense of claustrophobia, focusing instead on the task ahead and the freedom that lay on the other side of success. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 20 minutes, they reached the end of the tunnel. A small shaft of moonlight penetrated through cracks in the boards that had been used to seal the exit. Mason listened intently, then carefully removed the boards one by one, setting them aside without a sound. They emerged behind a storage shed just as Thomas had indicated. The administrative building was visible 50 yards away, its windows dark except for a single lamp burning in what must have been Mercer's office. Guards patrolled along set routes, their movements predictable as they passed lanterns placed at regular intervals. Mason checked his pocket watch. "We have 12 minutes until the next patrol passes this way," he whispered. "Then another 15 before the one after that." Nell nodded, her eyes already fixed on their destination. "Enough time if we move quickly." They waited in the shadows until the nearest guard had passed, then darted across the open ground, keeping low and using the buildings for cover. Years of living in the wilderness had taught Mason how to move silently, and Nell followed his example, placing her feet with care to avoid any sound that might betray their presence. They reached the back door of the administrative building without incident. The lock was simple, designed to keep out curious workers rather than determined intruders. Mason had it open in seconds using the small set of picks Thomas had provided. Inside the building was silent and dark save for the faint glow of lamplight coming from beneath a door at the far end of the hallway, Mercer's office. They moved toward it with extreme caution, testing each floorboard before putting their full weight on it. At the door to the outer office, they paused, listening. No sound came from within. Mason tried the handle and found it unlocked. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them. The clerk's office was neat and orderly, with filing cabinets along one wall and a large desk positioned to screen visitors before they could reach the inner sanctum. A second door, this one made of heavy oak with a brass nameplate reading C. Mercer, stood closed at the far end of the room. Mason moved to the window, peering out to check for approaching guards. "Clear for now," he whispered, "but we need to hurry." Nell approached Mercer's door, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it must be audible. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening for any sign of occupation. Hearing nothing, she tried the handle. Locked. "Stand back," Mason murmured, kneeling to examine the lock. It was more substantial than the one on the back door, but still within his capabilities. He worked quickly, the picks moving with surprising delicacy in his weathered hands. A soft click, and the door swung inward. Mercer's office was exactly as Nell remembered it, opulent compared to the rest of the compound, with a large mahogany desk, leather chairs, and bookshelves filled with volumes that were more for show than for reading. A decanter of whiskey sat on a silver tray, and maps of the surrounding territory covered one wall with red pins marking locations of interest. And there behind the desk hung the painting Nell had described, a dramatic depiction of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, with the Confederate flag prominently displayed despite the historical inaccuracy of the scene. "Watch the window," Nell instructed, moving behind the desk. She carefully lifted the painting from the wall, revealing a small wall of safe just as she had described. Mason took a position by the window, dividing his attention between the compound outside and Nell's progress with the safe. She worked the combination with steady hands, her lips moving silently as she counted the turns. Right to 4 left, to on right to 32. A soft click and the safe doors swung open. Inside were stacks of papers, bundles of wholesome, and a small leather-bound book. Nell reached for the book, her fingers trembling slightly as she withdrew it. "This is it," she whispered, flipping it open to confirm. Mercer's real ledger. The pages were filled with neat columns of names, dates, and amounts. Each entry represented a person reduced to property, a life valued only for the labor it could produce. Nell found the page that matched the fragment she carried, the list of 187 souls currently imprisoned at Eagle Crest. "Got it," she said, tucking the book securely inside her shirt. "Let's go." As she closed the safe and replaced the painting, Mason suddenly tensed at the window. "Someone's coming," he hissed. "Not a regular patrol." Nell froze, her blood turning cold. "Mercer?" "Can't tell." Two men moving purposefully toward the building. They had perhaps a minute, no more. Mason glanced around the room, assessing their options. There was no other exit from the office, and the tunnel was too far to reach before the newcomers entered the building. "Hide," he decided, moving to the clerk's desk in the outer office. "I'll create a diversion. When they're distracted, make for the tunnel. Don't stop for anything." Mason marked him. "Go," he insisted, giving her a gentle push toward a large cabinet in the corner of Mercer's office. "Remember your promise." Before she could protest further, he slipped into the outer office, closing Mercer's door behind him. Nell hesitated only a moment before squeezing into the cabinet, pulling the door nearly closed, but leaving a small crack through which she could see part of the room. Outside, she heard the main door to the building open, followed by the heavy tread of boots on wooden floors. Male voices too low to distinguish words. Then Mason's voice, loud and deliberately slurred. "Evening, gentlemen. Fine night for a drink, wouldn't you say?" A moment of stunned silence, then, "Who the hell are you? How did you get in here?" "Name's Collins. New guard. Started yesterday. Captain Blackwood said I could help myself to a drink if I finished my patrol early." Mason's voice had transformed completely, taking on the accent and cadence of a man from the deep south. "Door was unlocked, so I figured it was all right." "There's no new guard named Collins," said a second voice, suspicious and hard. "And this building is off limits to everyone but Mr. Mercer and his staff." "Well, now that's embarrassing," Mason drawled. "Must have misunderstood the captain." "Been a long day, you know how it is. I'll just be on my way." Through the crack in the cabinet door, Nell could see a sliver of the outer office. Mason was backing toward the main entrance, hands raised in a placating gesture. Two guards blocked his path, their expressions visible even from her limited vantage point, skeptical, hostile. "You're not going anywhere until we sort this out," said the first guard, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Blackwood will want to talk to you." "Now, boys, let's not make this any bigger than it needs to be," Mason said, still maintaining his fabricated identity. "Just a simple misunderstanding. I'm new, still learning the ropes." "Shut up," snapped the second guard, drawing his weapon. "Hands where we can see them. You're coming with us to see the captain." For a brief moment, Nell thought Mason might comply, might allow himself to be taken in order to give her time to escape. Then she saw his stance shift subtly, his weight transferring into the balls of his feet. What happened next unfolded with such speed that Nell could barely track the movements. Mason lunged forward, deflecting the second guard's arm upward as the man fired. The shot went wide, splintering the ceiling. In the same fluid motion, Mason drove his fist into the man's throat, dropping him to his knees, gasping for air. The first guard managed to clear his holster, but Mason was already on him, grappling for control of the weapon. They crashed into the clerk's desk, sending papers flying. The revolver discharged, again the sound deafening in the confined space. For a heart-stopping moment, both men went still. Then the guard slumped to the floor, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Mason straightened the revolver now in his hand, his breathing heavy but controlled. He turned toward Mercer's office, his eyes meeting Nell's through the crack in the cabinet door. "Go," he mouthed silently. "Now." Nell pushed the cabinet door open, emerging just as shouts began to echo across the compound. The gunshots had been heard. "Not without you," she insisted. Mason shook his head, gesturing to his leg. In the dim light, Nell could see that his trousers were torn, revealing a bleeding wound just above the knee. The first guard's bullet had found its mark after all. "I'll slow you down," he said grimly. "The ledger is what matters. Get to the rendezvous point. Thomas and Sullivan will come." "Mason, go," he ordered, his voice sharp with urgency. "I'll hold them off as long as I can. Give you time." Outside, lanterns were moving toward the administrative building, guards responding to the alarm. They had perhaps a minute before the place would be swarming with armed men. Nell made her decision. Crossing to Mason, she pressed something into his hand, the fragment of the ledger she had carried since her escape. "In case they take the book," she explained, "at least Sullivan will have this much proof." Then, before she could lose her courage, she leaned forward and pressed a quick kiss to his weathered cheek. "Stay alive," she whispered fiercely. "I didn't find you, after all these years, just to lose you now." With that, she was gone, slipping out the back door into the night. Mason watched her go, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face before it settled into a mask of grim determination. He checked the revolver's cylinder, 4 shots remaining, and positioned himself where he could cover both entrances to the building. As the first guards burst through the main door, Mason Reed prepared to make his final stand, not for himself, but for a promise made 12 years too late, and for the daughter of a woman who had died in his arms. Nell ran through the darkness, her heart pounding with fear and grief. Behind her, the sounds of gunfire erupted from the administrative building, Mason buying her time with his life. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back to help him, but she forced herself onward, clutching the precious ledger against her chest. The storage shed loomed ahead, and beyond it, the entrance to the tunnel that would lead her to safety. She reached it without being spotted, slipping inside and replacing the boards as best she could with trembling hands. The darkness of the tunnel enveloped her, absolute and disorienting. She felt her way forward, fighting panic as the sounds of pursuit faded behind her. Mason's instructions echoed in her mind. "Follow the wall, right fork, 200 yards." Time lost meaning in the lightless passage. Nell moved as quickly as she dared, painfully aware that each second might be Mason's last. The ledger pressed against her ribs, a constant reminder of why she couldn't turn back. 187 lives, depending on her success. When she finally emerged from the tunnel into the moonlit night, she allowed herself a moment to catch her breath, listening for any sign of pursuit. The mining compound was in chaos, lanterns moving in all directions as guards searched for intruders. In the distance, she could still hear the sporadic gunfire from the direction of the administrative building. Steeling herself against the thought of what might be happening to Mason, Nell turned and began the long journey toward the rendezvous point Thomas had designated, a small cabin on the banks of the Verde River, 15 miles to the east. If all went according to plan, Thomas would meet her there the following evening with Sheriff Sullivan. But plans, as Nell had learned throughout her life, rarely survive contact with reality. She had covered perhaps 5 miles, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main trails when she heard the sound she had been dreading, hoofbeats approaching from behind. Mercer's men had picked up her trail. Nell increased her pace, but she knew she couldn't outrun horses, not in this terrain, not in her condition. The wounds on her back had reopened during her flight, and exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. She needed to hide to find a place where mounted pursuers couldn't follow. A rocky outcropping appeared ahead, offering the possibility of shelter. Nell scrambled toward it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The hoofbeats were growing louder, at least 3 riders moving at a steady trot. The outcropping turned out to be the entrance to a narrow ravine too tight for horses to navigate, but just wide enough for a person. Nell squeezed through the opening, scraping her shoulders painfully against the rough stone walls, and found herself in a natural channel carved by centuries of flash floods. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to control her breathing as the riders approached. Their voices carried clearly in the night air. "Tracks lead this way," said one, his tone confident. "Can't be far ahead." "Blackwood wants her alive," replied another. "Mercer's orders." "What about the man?" A harsh laugh. "Won't be a problem anymore. Took 6 bullets before he stopped shooting. Killed 4 of our boys." Nell closed her eyes, fighting back a wave of anguish. Mason, gone. After surviving a war, after 12 years in the wilderness, after finally finding her, Clara's daughter, only to die protecting her escape. "The ravine," said the third rider, closer now. "She could have gone in there." "Too narrow for horses," observed the first. "Michaels, check it out on foot. We'll keep looking ahead in case she doubled back." Nell tensed as the sound of boots on stone reached her ears. A man was entering the ravine, moving cautiously, a lantern held high to illuminate the way. She pressed herself into a small hollow in the wall, praying the shadows would be deep enough to conceal her. The light grew brighter, casting long shadows that danced across the stone walls. Nell held her breath, one hand pressed against the ledger hidden beneath her shirt, the other gripping a sharp stone. She had found a poor weapon, but the only one available. The man Michaels was only a few yards away now, his breathing audible in the confined space. The lantern light swept across the ravine floor, searching for tracks, for any sign of recent passage. It was only a matter of moments before it would find her. A sound from further down the ravine, small stones clattering down the wall, drew the man's attention. The light swung away from Nell, pointing deeper into the channel. "Who's there?" Michaels called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Show yourself." When no response came, he moved forward cautiously, the lantern extended before him like a shield. As he passed Nell's hiding place, his attention fixed on whatever had made the noise, she saw her chance. Rising silently, she brought the stone down on the back of his head with all the strength she could muster. Michaels crumpled, without a sound, the lantern falling from his grasp. Nell caught it before it could shatter, plunging the ravine back into darkness. For a moment, she stood frozen, listening. The other riders were still nearby, their voices carrying faintly from further along the trail. She needed to move, but which way? Back the way she had come, where the riders might be waiting, or deeper into the ravine where it might narrow to nothing, trapping her. The decision was made for her when one of the riders called out, "Michaels, you find anything?" With no time to deliberate further, Nell extinguished the lantern and moved deeper into the ravine, feeling her way along the rough walls. The channel twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow she had to turn sideways to pass, other times opening into small chambers where flash floods had carved out deeper pools. Behind her, she could hear voices growing more concerned at Michael's continued absence. Soon they would come looking for their companion, and when they found him unconscious, or worse, if she had struck harder than she intended, the hunt would intensify. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, Nell felt a change in the air, a freshness that suggested an opening ahead. The ravine had led her through the heart of a small mesa and was about to emerge on the other side. She approached the exit, cautiously aware that she would be silhouetted against the night sky for anyone watching. The opening revealed a steep slope leading down to a stand of juniper trees, beyond which lay open country illuminated by moonlight. Taking a deep breath, Nell began her descent, careful to keep low and use the sparse vegetation for cover. If she could reach the trees, she might be able to circle back toward the rendezvous point without being spotted. A shot rang out, the bullet striking the ground near her feet. Nell froze her hair, seeming to stop in her chest. "That's far enough," called a voice from the darkness. "Next one won't miss." From the shadows beneath the junipers emerged a figure Nell recognized instantly, even in the dim light. Samuel Blackwood, Mercer's foreman, and the man directly responsible for the scars on her back. He held a rifle aimed steadily at her chest. "You've led us on quite a chase, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice carrying a false pleasantness that was more terrifying than open rage. "Mr. Mercer is very eager to continue your conversation." "Mercer is a murderer," Nell replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite her fear. "A slaver, a war criminal." Blackwood shrugged, unmoved by the accusations. "He's also the man who pays my salary. Now you have something that belongs to him." I suggest you hand it over before things get unpleasant. Nell's hand moved instinctively to her shirt where the ledger was concealed. Blackwood noticed the gesture and smiled thinly. That's right, the book. Give it to me, and perhaps Mr. Mercer will be merciful. We both know there's no mercy in Mercer, Nell said, stalling for time as she desperately tried to think of a way out. Not for me, not for anyone who crosses him. True enough, Blackwood admitted with chilling candor. But there are degrees of suffering, Miss Hayes. Quick or slow, your choice. Nell glanced around, assessing her options. The slope behind her was too exposed she'd be shot before she could reach the ravine again. The junipers offered some cover, but Blackwood stood between her and the trees, his rifle unwavering. Your friend made his choice. Blackwood continued, correctly interpreting her search for escape routes. Died hard, you don't have to follow his example. At the mention of Mason, something shifted in Nell's expression, a hardening, a resolve that replaced fear with cold determination. Mason Reed was worth 10 of you, she said, her voice low and dangerous, and 100 of Mercer. Blackwood's smile faltered slightly at the change in her demeanor. The ledger, Miss Hayes. Now. Nell straightened, meeting his gaze directly. You want it? Come and take it. For a moment, Blackwood seemed taken aback by her defiance. Then his face darkened with anger. Have it your way. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, taking careful aim. A shot cracked through the night air. Blackwood staggered, a look of utter surprise crossing his face as he looked down at the dark stains spreading across his chest. The rifle slipped from his fingers as he sank to his knees, then toppled face first onto the stony ground. Nell stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had happened. She hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't seen any movement in the darkness beyond Blackwood. Nell. The voice, impossibly familiar, came from the shadows beneath the junipers. A figure emerged, limping heavily, one arm pressed against his side, the other holding a revolver that still trailed wisps of smoke. Mason? Nell whispered, disbelieving. He moved into the moonlight, and Nell gasped at the sight. His clothing was torn and blood-stained, his face streaked with dirt and gunpowder. The wound in his leg had been roughly bandaged, but fresh blood seeped through the cloth. Despite it all, his eyes were clear and focused, fixed on her with an intensity that spoke of relief beyond words. You're alive, she breathed, rushing to his side as his strength finally began to fail. She caught him as he stumbled, helping him to a sitting position against a juniper trunk. They said you were dead. 6 bullets. Exaggerated. Mason managed, his voice strained but tinged with grim humor. Only took 2. The rest missed. Nell knelt beside him, her hands moving to assess his wounds. How did you escape? How did you find me? Thomas, Mason explained between labored breaths. Came back when he heard the shooting. Got me out through a back window while they were focused on the front. He gestured toward the ravine. Tracked you here. Wasn't hard. You left a trail a blind man could follow. Nell smiled despite the dire circumstances, recognizing the gentle admonishment from a man who had lived in the wilderness for over a decade. I'll do better next time. Next time, Mason echoed, a hint of wonder in his voice at the idea of a shared future. Then his expression sobered. The ledger, safe, Nell assured him, patting her shirt. All the proof Sullivan will need. Mason nodded satisfaction, briefly overriding the pain in his eyes. Thomas is bringing him to the rendezvous point tomorrow. If we can make it there, we will, Nell said with firm conviction. Together. She helped Mason to his feet, supporting him as he tested his injured leg. Lean on me, it's not far. As they began their slow journey through the moonlit Arizona night, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were no longer 2 broken souls seeking justice for separate wounds. They had become something more, 2 halves of a story begun in tragedy at Willow Creek, and continuing now toward an uncertain but shared future. Behind them, the Eagle Crest Mining Company continued its operations, unaware that its darkest secrets were traveling steadily away in the hands of a woman who had once been a frightened child hiding in a hollow log, and a soldier who had spent 12 years trying to outrun his ghosts. Ahead lay the rendezvous point, and beyond that the promise of justice, not just for the 187 souls imprisoned at Eagle Crest, but for all those who had suffered and died at Willow Creek 12 years before. And somewhere perhaps Clara was watching her final wish fulfilled. At last her daughter had found the soldier with kind eyes, and together they were completing the circle that had begun on that terrible day. The Arizona hills witnessed their passage in silence, the ancient landscape indifferent to human struggles, yet somehow shaped by them. Nonetheless a fitting backdrop for a journey of redemption that had been 12 years in the making. Dawn found Mason and Nell sheltered within a shallow cave, exhaustion having finally claimed them both after their harrowing escape. Outside, the Arizona landscape was transformed by the first light of day, harsh shadows giving way to the subtle palette of reds and golds that painted the rocky terrain. A gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and juniper, nature's quiet reminder that life continued regardless of human struggles. Mason woke first, his soldier's instincts still sharp despite his injuries. For a moment he lay perfectly still, listening to the world around him, assessing potential threats before making any movement that might draw attention. Satisfied that they were alone, he turned his head slightly to look at Nell, who slept beside him, her features softened in repose. In sleep, with a constant tension of vigilance absent from her face, she looked remarkably like her mother. Mason felt a tightening in his chest at the thought. Clara's child. After 12 years of believing he had failed completely at Willow Creek, fate had granted him an unexpected redemption, the chance to protect the daughter when he couldn't save the mother. Nell stirred her eyes opening to find Mason watching her. A small smile touched her lips, then faded as memory returned, and with it awareness of their precarious situation. How bad? She asked, nodding toward his injuries. Mason shifted, testing the limits of his wounded body. I've had worse, he replied, though the tightness in his voice belied the casual dismissal. The leg's not good, but it'll hold. Ribs are just bruised, I think. Nell sat up carefully, mindful of her own reopened wounds. Let me check the bandages. With gentle efficiency, she unwrapped the crude dressing on his leg. The wound was angry and red, but the bleeding had mostly stopped. Using the water from their single canteen, she cleaned it as best she could, then rebandaged it with strips torn from her own undershirt. We need to move soon, Mason said as she worked. Mercer will have men combing every inch of these hills by now. Nell nodded, her expression grave. How far to the rendezvous point? 8 miles, maybe 9. Mason looked out at the brightening sky. We've lost time. Should have been there already. Thomas will wait, Nell said with quiet confidence. He'll know something delayed us. It's not Thomas I'm worried about. Mason's voice took on a harder edge. If Mercer figures out where we're headed, he'll send men to intercept. The ledger is too damaging to let it reach the law. As if reminded of their precious cargo, Nell's hand went to her shirt, where the ledger remained safely hidden. We should get moving then. Rising to her feet, she helped Mason stand, supporting him as he tested his injured leg. It held his weight, barely sending fresh waves of pain up his side with each step. Neither spoke of what they both knew at this pace, with Mason's injuries slowing them. The journey to the rendezvous point would take most of the day. Time they might not have. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern horizon. Mason leaning on a sturdy branch fashioned into a walking stick, Nell staying close to offer support when needed. Their progress was painfully slow. Each step a careful negotiation between speed and stealth, between Mason's dwindling strength and the unforgiving terrain. By midday, the heat had become another enemy. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, drawing precious moisture from their bodies, with no water source in sight to replenish it. Their single canteen was nearly empty, and they still had at least 4 miles to go. Rest, Nell insisted as Mason stumbled for the third time in as many minutes. Just for a moment. They found meager shade beneath an overhanging rock, collapsing gratefully into its relative coolness. Mason's face was drawn with pain and exhaustion, his skin pale beneath the dirt and stubble. The crude bandage on his leg had begun to seep blood, again a worrying sign. Nell offered him the last of their water, which he accepted with reluctance, taking only a small sip before handing it back. Keep it, he said. You'll need your strength. So will you, she countered, but didn't press the issue. They sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The vast landscape stretched out before them, indifferent to their suffering, yet somehow comforting in its constancy. These hills had witnessed countless human struggles over the centuries, would witness countless more long after they were gone. Tell me about her, Mason said suddenly, his voice soft but clear in the stillness. Your mother, Clara. Nell looked at him, surprised by the request, yet understanding the need behind it. She was kind, she began, her eyes growing distant with memory. Even when things were hardest, she found ways to be kind. She used to sing while she worked old spirituals mostly, but sometimes songs she made up just for me. Mason listened, his expression a mixture of pain and wonder as Nell shared fragments of Clara's life, how she had taught herself to read from discarded newspapers, how she had dreamed of opening a school for freed children, how she had protected Nell fiercely from the harshness of a world still hostile to their very existence. She talked about you know, Nell said softly. Not by name, she never knew it. But she spoke of a Union soldier who had helped their community, who treated them like people when so many others didn't. She said if I ever needed help and couldn't find her, I should look for a man with eyes like yours. Mason turned away, overcome by emotion he couldn't express. 12 years of solitude had left him ill-equipped to handle such moments of raw connection. I should have done more, he said finally, the words catching in his throat. For all of them. For her. You did what you could, Nell replied gently. She knew that. It's why she trusted you with me even at the end. A trust he had failed to honor, though neither of them spoke the thought aloud. Instead, Mason pushed himself to his feet, using the walking stick for support. We should keep moving, he said, his voice steadier now. Still have a long way to go. As they resumed their journey, a new understanding seemed to have formed between them, a connection deeper than their shared mission, more profound than their linked past. They moved as one through the harsh landscape, each supporting the other. When strength failed, each drawing resolve from the other's determination. The afternoon wore on, bringing with it lengthening shadows and a slight cooling of the air. Their progress remained slow but steady, guided by Mason's unerring sense of direction, even in this trackless wilderness. The rendezvous point was growing closer, perhaps 2 miles away now, when Mason suddenly halted, raising a hand in warning. Nell froze beside him, instantly alert. What is it? Mason didn't answer immediately, his head cocked slightly as he listened to something beyond the range of Nell's perception. Then she heard it too, the faint but unmistakable sound of horses moving at a walk somewhere ahead of them. Down, Mason whispered, pulling Nell with him into the shelter of a scrubby juniper thicket. They lay perfectly still as the sounds grew closer, multiple riders moving cautiously along the faint trail that led toward the Verde River, toward the rendezvous point. Mercer's men, Nell breathed her lips close to Mason's ear. Maybe, he replied, equally quiet. Or Sullivan's deputies. Can't tell from here. They needed to know which, but revealing themselves to the wrong group would be fatal. Mason considered their options, each one carrying a significant risk. Before he could decide, however, a familiar bird call sounded from somewhere in the rocks above them. 3 notes, then 2, then 3 beat again. Thomas's signal. Relief flooded through Mason. He returned the call as best he could, then struggled to his feet, helping Nell up beside him. From around a bend in the trail appeared Thomas Running Elk, mounted on his pinto horse. Behind him rode 5 other men led by a broad-shouldered figure with a silver star pinned to his vest, Sheriff Edgar Sullivan. "Mason Reed," Sullivan called as they approached, his deep voice carrying easily across the distance. "Thought you were dead years ago." "Came close a few times," Mason replied, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "Including yesterday." Sullivan dismounted, handing his reins to one of his deputies. He was a big man with a square jaw, partially hidden beneath a neatly trimmed beard, shot through with gray. His eyes, however, were what most people remembered, pale blue and unnervingly direct, missing nothing. "Thomas told me some of it," he said, clasping Mason's hand in a firm grip. "Said you needed help with Clayton Mercer and his operation at Eagle Crest." His gaze shifted to Nell, assessing her in a single glance. "This the lady Eleanor Hayes," Mason confirmed. "She has proof of what Mercer's been doing." Nell stepped forward, withdrawing the ledger from its hiding place beneath her shirt. 187 people, she said, handing the book to Sullivan. "Names, dates, where they were taken from, how much was paid for them. Everything you need to shut Mercer down and free those people." Sullivan opened the ledger, his expression hardening as he scanned the meticulously recorded details of human trafficking and forced labor. "This is enough for a hanging," he said grimly. "Maybe several." "There's more," Mason added. "Mercer was the commanding officer of the 18th Tennessee during the war, responsible for the massacre at Willow Creek, a freedmen's settlement. Nell is a survivor." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "I remember hearing about Willow Creek, ugly business." He turned to Nell. "You were there." "I was a child," she replied. "My mother died protecting me. Mason tried to save her, but it was too late." Understanding dawned on Sullivan's face as he looked between Mason and Nell, seeing the connection that bound them across 12 years of separation. "Well," he said finally, "seems like fate has a way of coming full circle." He gestured to his deputies, who had remained mounted during the exchange. "We've got horses for you both. Thomas said you might be in rough shape." Looks like he was right. As one of the deputies brought forward 2 spare mounts, Thomas rode up beside Mason. "Glad you made it," he said simply. "Was starting to worry." "Had some trouble getting out," Mason replied, the understatement drawing a wry smile from his friend. "Mercer's men were closer than we thought." Thomas nodded, his dark eyes serious. "They're still close. Passed a group heading this way about an hour back, keeping to the high ground so they didn't spot us." Sullivan overheard this exchange and frowned. "How many?" "6, maybe 7 riders," Thomas reported, armed, moving like they knew where they were going. "Blackwood must have told them about the rendezvous point before I—" Nell's voice trailed off, the memory of killing the foreman still fresh and disturbing. "Before you did what you had to," Mason finished for her, his tone leaving no room for guilt. "He wouldn't have shown you mercy." Sullivan's gaze sharpened with interest, but he asked no questions about Blackwood's fate. Instead, he turned to his deputies. "Mount up. We're heading back to Prescott now. If Mercer's men are nearby, I'd rather not have a shootout with injured civilians in the crossfire." With Thomas's help, Mason managed to climb into the saddle, though the effort left him pale and sweating. Nell mounted more easily, her smaller injuries less debilitating than Mason's gunshot wound. "Stay close," Sullivan instructed, as they set out, 2 deputies taking the lead, 2 following behind, with Sullivan, Mason, Nell, and Thomas in the center of the formation. "If there's trouble, let my men handle it. That's what they're paid for." They rode at a steady pace, following a trail that paralleled the Verde River as it wound through the rugged landscape. The setting sun cast long shadows across their path, turning the red rocks to deep crimson and the sparse vegetation to silhouettes against the darkening sky. Mason rode in silence, each hoofbeat sending fresh pain through his injured leg, each breath a careful negotiation with his bruised ribs. Beside him, Nell seemed lost in her own thoughts, her face set in lines of determination despite her obvious exhaustion. They had covered perhaps 3 miles when Thomas, who had been riding slightly ahead, suddenly raised his hand in a signal to halt. The entire party drew rein, tension rippling through them as Thomas pointed silently to a ridge overlooking the trail ahead. Sullivan squinted in the fading light, then cursed under his breath. "Ambush," he murmured. "They're waiting for us up there." Mason followed his gaze and saw what the sheriff had spotted, the faint glint of metal among the rocks, the unnatural stillness that betrayed men lying in wait. Mercer's men had gotten ahead of them, somehow had chosen their ground with care to intercept anyone traveling this trail. "How many?" Mason asked quietly. "Can't tell for sure," Sullivan replied. At least 4 on that ridge, probably more we can't see. Is there another way around? Nell asked, her voice steady despite the danger. Thomas shook his head. Not without backtracking 5 miles and crossing the river. Would put us in Prescott well after dark. And give them time to set up another ambush, Mason added. They know where we're headed. Sullivan considered their options, his experienced eye assessing the terrain, calculating risks and probabilities, with the precision of a man accustomed to making life or death decisions. We could try to outrun them, he said finally, make a dash for it, rely on speed and surprise. Not with Mason's leg, Nell objected immediately. The first hard gallop would reopen his wound. And they'd have clear shots at us from that height, Thomas pointed out. Be like shooting fish in a barrel. Sullivan nodded grimly, acknowledging the truth in both observations. Only one option left then, he said, turning to his deputies. We call them out. Show of force. The deputies exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of determination and concern. They were lawmen accustomed to facing danger, but an ambush was different from the usual confrontations they handled. Mercer's men aren't soldiers, Mason said, reading their thoughts. They're bullies used to intimidating unarmed workers. When faced with real opposition, most will break. Most, Sullivan emphasized, but not all, and it only takes one good shot. He left the thought unfinished, but everyone understood the implication. Someone might not survive the next few minutes. I'll go first, Sullivan decided, straightening in his saddle. Show the badge, give them a chance to surrender. He turned to Mason. Keep her back, he said, nodding toward Nell. If things go bad, you two make for the river. Thomas knows where to meet you. Before anyone could object, Sullivan nudged his horse forward, emerging from the shelter of a stand of cottonwoods into the open trail. He stopped in full view of the ridge, his badge gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. This is Sheriff Edgar Sullivan of Yavapai County, he called, his powerful voice echoing across the canyon. I know you're up there. Show yourselves. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a figure stood up from behind the rocks, a tall man in a black coat, a rifle cradled in his arms. Even at this distance, there was something commanding about his presence, an aura of authority that marked him as different from the ordinary hired guns. Clayton Mercer, Nell whispered, her hands tightening on the reins until her knuckles showed white. He came himself. This doesn't concern you, Sheriff, Mercer called down, his voice carrying the cultured accent of a Southern gentleman. My business is with the 2 thieves hiding behind your deputies. Your business is with me now, Sullivan replied evenly. I have evidence of serious crimes committed at your mining operation. Kidnapping, forced labor, murder. I'm placing you under arrest. A laugh cold and dismissive floated down from the ridge. Evidence? The word of a runaway thief and a hermit who hasn't spoken to another human in years. No jury would convict on that. Not just their word, Sullivan countered. I have your ledger, Mercer, the real one with all the names and dates, every person you've bought and worked to death, all recorded in your own hand. A long silence followed this revelation. Mason could almost see the calculations running through Mercer's mind, weighing options, considering angles, looking for a way out. Finally, the former colonel spoke again, his voice hardened with resolve. That ledger is my private property, stolen from my office. Return it now, and I might be persuaded to let this matter drop. Not going to happen, Sullivan said firmly. The way I see it, you have 2 choices. Surrender peacefully and face trial, or resist and face my deputies. Either way, your operation at Eagle Crest is finished. Another pause, longer this time. Then Mercer raised his hand in a signal, and suddenly the ridge came alive with movement as men with rifles rose from their hiding places, not 4 as Sullivan had estimated, but at least 8. I see your deputies, Sheriff, Mercer called down, confidence restored by the show of force. 4 men against my 8. Poor odds, wouldn't you say? Sullivan didn't flinch. Last chance, Mercer. Come down peaceful-like, or we'll bring you down. Mason tensed, sensing the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Behind him, he could feel Nell's presence, could almost hear her heart pounding in rhythm with his own. If shooting started, their chances were slim. Then a new voice joined the standoff, Thomas, who had ridden up beside Sullivan, while all attention was focused on the confrontation. 8 against 4 might be poor odds, Colonel, he called up to Mercer, using the man's military title deliberately. But what about 8 against 20? At Thomas's signal, figures emerged from the trees and rocks on both sides of the trail, men of various ages and backgrounds, some white, some black, some Hispanic, all armed and all focused intently on the ridge where Mercer and his men stood. Mason recognized some of them, former slaves he had helped escape through the Underground Railroad before settling in Arizona. Local farmers who had lost family members to Mercer's operation, even a few who must have been recent escapees from Eagle Crest itself, judging by their gaunt faces and haunted eyes. Thomas, Mason breathed, amazed at what his friend had accomplished. Been busy while you were at Eagle Crest, Thomas replied with quiet satisfaction. Word travels fast when people have reason to hope. Up on the ridge, Mercer's men were shifting nervously, their earlier confidence evaporating as they found themselves outnumbered and surrounded. Only Mercer himself seemed unmoved, his stance rigid with the pride that had defined his life. This changes nothing, he declared, though the waver in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. These people have no authority. This is still my land, my territory. Not anymore, Sullivan responded. And they have all the authority they need. The authority of justice too long denied. He raised his voice to address Mercer's men directly. Any man who surrenders now will be treated fairly. Resist and I can't make any promises. The effect was immediate. Two of Mercer's men lowered their rifles, then another and another, until only Mercer himself and one loyal subordinate still stood defiant. Cowards, Mercer spat at his deserting men. Traitors. It's over, Colonel, Sullivan called up. Don't make this worse than it already is. For a moment, it seemed Mercer might surrender. Then, with a movement so swift it caught everyone by surprise, he raised his rifle and fired not at Sullivan or the deputies, but directly at Nell. Mason reacted instinctively, throwing himself sideways out of the saddle to shield her. The bullet whizzed past where she had been sitting a split second earlier, embedding itself in a tree trunk with a solid thunk. Chaos erupted as Sullivan's deputies and Thomas's volunteers returned fire, their bullets kicking up dust around Mercer and his remaining loyalist. The colonel ducked behind the rocks, firing again blindly down into the trail. Mason found himself on the ground, his injured legs screaming in protest at the rough treatment. Nell was beside him, having also dismounted to take cover behind a boulder. Their horses had bolted at the first shots, leaving them exposed except for the minimal shelter of the rock. Stay down, Mason ordered, drawing the revolver he had taken from Blackwood. Though not a natural shooter with his left hand, he could still contribute to the firefight if necessary. Above them, the exchange of gunfire continued, unabated bullets ricocheting off rocks and splintering tree branches. Sullivan and his deputies had taken cover as well, returning fire with disciplined precision. Thomas and his volunteers spread out, some working their way up the sides of the ridge to flank Mercer's position. He was aiming for me specifically, Nell said, her voice tight with realization. Not Sullivan, not the deputies, wholesome. You're the witness he fears most, Mason replied, the one with the strongest connection to Willow Creek. A cry from above signaled that one of Mercer's men, perhaps the last loyalist, had been hit. The firing from the ridge decreased noticeably after that, reduced to a single rifle still firing at regular intervals. Sullivan seized the opportunity, signaling his deputies to advance up the slope while maintaining covering fire. Thomas and several volunteers moved with them, creating a tightening noose around Mercer's position. The colonel continued to fight his shots, becoming more desperate as his situation grew more hopeless. Then suddenly the firing stopped altogether. A tense silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the calls of deputies confirming their positions to each other. Did they get him? Nell whispered. Before Mason could answer, a scrabbling sound from the rocks above made them both look up. Clayton Mercer was descending the far side of the ridge, having abandoned his indefensible position in favor of escape. He moved with surprising agility for a man his age, leaping from rock to rock with the desperation of someone who knew capture meant the gallows. Sullivan, Mason called out, pointing to the fleeing figure. There? The sheriff turned, spotting Mercer, just as the colonel reached the bottom of the slope and dashed toward a stand of trees where a horse must have been hidden. Deputies scrambled to cut off his escape, but they were too far away, their positions chosen for the firefight, rather than to prevent a retreat in this direction. Without hesitation, Mason raised his revolver, steadying it against the boulder. The distance was extreme for a handgun, especially in his weakened condition, but he had no choice. If Mercer reached those trees, he would escape, and with him would vanish any chance of justice for Willow Creek, for Clara, for all those who had suffered under his cruelty. Mason took a deep breath, steadying himself. He sighted along the barrel, leading the running figure slightly to compensate for distance and movement. As his finger tightened on the trigger, he felt a hand on his arm. Nell, her touch gentle but firm. Wait, she said softly. Mason glanced at her, questioning. Mercer was almost to the trees now, seconds from escape. Let me, Nell said, her eyes meeting his with a determination that brooked no argument. Understanding flooded through Mason. This wasn't just about stopping Mercer. It was about closing a circle, about a daughter claiming justice for her mother in the most direct way possible. Without a word, he handed her the revolver. Nell took it, her hand steady as she assumed the firing position Mason had shown. She sighted carefully, her breathing calm and controlled despite the enormity of the moment. Mason watched, sensing that something profound was happening, a transformation, a reckoning, a healing. The shot, when it came, cracked across the canyon like a pronouncement of judgment. Mercer stumbled, took another step, then collapsed just short of the tree line, his escape cut short by a bullet from the daughter of a woman he had ordered killed 12 years before. A heavy silence descended upon the scene, as if the very landscape were holding its breath in acknowledgement of what had transpired. Then Sullivan's voice broke the spell, calling orders to his deputies to secure the area and check for any remaining threats. Nell lowered the revolver slowly, her expression a complex mixture of emotions, relief, grief, a strange kind of peace. She handed the weapon back to Mason without looking at him, her gaze still fixed on the distant figure lying motionless by the trees. It's done, she said simply. Mason nodded, understanding all that those two words encompassed. Yes, he agreed, it's done. Thomas approached them, concern evident in his face as he took in Mason's worsened condition. Need to get you to a doctor, he said, kneeling to examine the leg wound, which had indeed reopened during the chaos. Both of you. As he worked to rebandage the injury, Sullivan joined them, his weathered face grave but satisfied. Mercer, Mason asked, though he already knew the answer. Dead, Sullivan confirmed. Clean shot, center mass. He looked at Nell with newfound respect. You're doing, I take it? Nell met his gaze steadily. Yes. The sheriff nodded, asking no further questions. In this frontier land, justice sometimes came from unexpected quarters, and Sullivan was pragmatic enough to recognize when official process and moral right aligned, even if the methods might raise eyebrows, in more civilized settings. What about Eaglecrest? Mason asked. The workers. My deputies are already on their way there, Sullivan replied. With Mercer dead and the ledger as evidence, we have everything we need to shut down the operation and free those people. He glanced at the volunteers who had come with Thomas, many of whom were now helping to round up the surrendered gunmen. Seems like they'll have somewhere to go too. Your friend here has been organizing a settlement of sorts. Thomas shrugged modestly at Mason's questioning look. Just putting your old cabin to good use, he explained. Folks need a place to start over. The implications of this statement took a moment to sink in. My cabin, Mason repeated. A hint of a smile touched Thomas's lips. Figured you might not be needing it anymore. Not with unfinished business waiting for you elsewhere. Mason looked at Nell, who was watching this exchange with quiet attentiveness. Unfinished business, indeed. A life interrupted 12 years ago at Willow Creek, a promise to Clara that could finally be fulfilled, a chance to build something new from the ashes of the past. We should get moving, Sullivan interrupted, practical as always. Still a long ride to Prescott, and you both need medical attention. With Thomas's help, Mason managed to stand through the effort, left him lightheaded and nauseated. Nell moved to his side, immediately supporting him as she had throughout their journey. Lean on me, she said, echoing her words from the night before. We'll make it together. And so they did, step by painful step, moving forward into an uncertain future that for the first time in 12 years held the promise of something more than mere survival. The ride to Prescott passed in a blur of pain and fading consciousness for Mason. He was vaguely aware of being helped onto a horse, of Nell riding close beside him, of concerned voices when he began to slump in the saddle. By the time they reached the town, fever had set in, his body finally rebelling against the abuse it had endured. The next days were fragmented, disconnected impressions rather than a coherent narrative. The town doctor's concerned face as he cleaned and stitched the leg wound. Sullivan's voice reassuring and firm, providing updates on the situation at Eaglecrest. Thomas coming and going, a silent presence that somehow anchored Mason to reality when fever dreams threatened to sweep him away. And always consistently, Nell reading aloud from the local newspaper, changing bandages, with gentle hands placing cool cloths on his forehead when the fever burned hottest. Her voice became his touchstone, drawing him back when darkness pressed too close. On the 5th day the fever broke, Mason woke to find sunlight streaming through the window of an unfamiliar room, clean, simply furnished, with the sounds of a busy town filtering in from outside. For a moment he lay still, orienting himself to this new reality. Welcome back, said a quiet voice from beside the bed. Mason turned his head to find Nell sitting in a chair nearby, a book open in her lap. She looked different, rested clean, wearing a simple blue dress that someone must have provided. Her dark hair was neatly braided, falling over one shoulder in a thick rope that caught the sunlight. How long? Mason asked, his voice rough from disuse. 5 days, Nell replied, setting aside her book to pour him a glass of water from a pitcher on the bedside table. The doctor wasn't sure you'd make it, said the wound had festered, that you'd lost too much blood. Mason accepted the water gratefully, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. Eaglecrest, he asked after a moment. Shut down, Nell reported with satisfaction. Sullivan's deputies freed everyone, 187 people, just as the ledger said. Most have already left for California or other territories. Some stayed, though, gone to the settlement Thomas is organizing. At my cabin, Mason said, remembering this detail from before. Nell nodded, a smile touching her lips. He's expanded it considerably. Built new structures, planted gardens. Says it's becoming a proper community. Mason absorbed this information, finding that the idea of others using his solitary refuge didn't bother him as much as it might have once. And Mercer's men, the ones who surrendered, are in jail awaiting trial. Some will hang, others will serve time. Nell's expression sobered. They found Blackwood's body where I left him. Sullivan recorded it as a justifiable homicide in self-defense. No charges. The matter-of-fact way she related these details spoke volumes about how much she had changed in the short time since Mason had found her, stumbling through the Arizona hills. The frightened, wounded woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more certain of her place in the world. And you, Mason asked? What happens now? Nell was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Sullivan offered me a position teaching at the new school they're building here in Prescott, she finally said. Said they need educated women willing to work with children from all backgrounds. You'd be good at that, Mason observed. Your mother would be proud. A shadow crossed Nell's face at the mention of Clara, but it passed quickly, replaced by a gentle acceptance. I think she would, she agreed. It's what she wanted to do herself before. She didn't need to finish the thought. Before Willow Creek, before Mercer in the 18th Tennessee, before everything changed. What about you? She asked, turning the question back on Mason. When you're healed, will you go back to the hills? It was the same question she had asked the night before they infiltrated Eagle Crest, but now it carried different weight. Then it had been theoretical, a consideration for a future that might never come. Now it required a real answer, a decision about what remained of his life. I don't know, Mason admitted, the honesty somehow easier now than it had been before. Spent 12 years hiding from the world. Not sure I remember how to live in it. Nell's expression softened with understanding. Maybe you don't have to figure it out all at once, she suggested. Maybe it's enough to just take the first step and see where it leads. The wisdom in her words struck Mason forcefully. How had this young woman who had endured so much hardship managed to retain such clarity about life's journey? Perhaps it was Clara's legacy, a gift passed from mother to daughter that had survived even the horror of Willow Creek. A first step, he repeated thoughtfully. I suppose I could manage that much. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Thomas entered at Nell's invitation, his normally stoic expression breaking into a rare smile at the sight of Mason, conscious and alert. About time you rejoined the living, he said, crossing to stand beside the bed. Beginning to think you were enjoying all the attention. Mason snorted, wincing as the movement sent a twinge of pain through his healing ribs. Been better places to rest, that's certain. Thomas chuckled, then grew more serious. Brought some news you'll want to hear, he said. Sullivan got a telegraph from the territorial governor. Eagle Crest Mine is being officially deeded to the former workers as reparations. Land, buildings, equipment, and all of it. Nell's eyes widened at this unexpected development. That's incredible, she breathed. They'll have a real chance to build something. Already started, Thomas confirmed. Elected a council to manage things. Set up work schedules, profit sharing. He glanced at Mason with a hint of amusement. Asked if you'd consider coming on as an advisor once you're back on your feet. Said a man who can plan a jailbreak from Eagle Crest might have useful ideas for running it properly. Mason shook his head, bemused by the irony. Don't know the first thing about mining. Neither did they until Mercer forced them to learn, Thomas pointed out. They know the work. They just need help with the rest, contract, supplies, dealing with the authorities. He shrugged, just passing along the offer. Up to you what you do with it. The idea was so unexpected, so far from anything Mason had envisioned for himself, that he couldn't formulate an immediate response. After 12 years of isolation, to be asked to step into such a role to help guide a community of former slaves and immigrants as they built new lives was both daunting and strangely appealing. Think about it, Thomas suggested, reading Mason's conflicted expression. No rush to decide. Got at least a few weeks before the doctor says you can travel anyway. He stayed a while longer, sharing other news from around the territory and updates on the settlement forming around Mason's former cabin. When he finally departed, promising to return the next day, a comfortable silence fell over the room. Nell resumed her seat beside the bed, watching Mason with quiet attentiveness. An advisor to a mining community, she mused. Quite a change from the hermit of the Arizona hills. More than I bargained for when I followed those gunshots 5 days ago. Mason agreed, his voice tinged with dry humor. Would have been simpler to keep walking the other way. Simpler, Nell acknowledged, but not better. The truth of this observation settled between them, weighty yet somehow liberating. Nothing about the path they had traveled together had been simple, from that first desperate encounter to the final confrontation with Mercer. Yet in its complexity, in its pain and struggle, it had forged something valuable: redemption for Mason, justice for Nell, and for both of them, a chance to build something new from the ashes of the past. What would Clara think of all this, I wonder, Mason said softly, his thoughts turning once again to the woman whose death had set these events in motion 12 years before. Nell considered the question seriously. I think, she said finally, she would see it as proof that her faith wasn't misplaced. That even in her last moments she recognized something in you worth trusting with what she valued most. Mason turned away, overcome by emotion he still struggled to express. The weight of that trust, first from Clara, now from her daughter, pressed upon him with both gravity and grace. He had failed, the mother had carried that failure for 12 long years. Now fate had granted him a second chance with the daughter. Not to replace what was lost, but to honor it by moving forward. First steps, he murmured, returning to Nell's earlier wisdom. First steps, she agreed with a gentle smile. The rest will follow when it's time. Outside the window, Prescott continued its daily rhythm wagons, rattling down the street, voices calling greetings, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer shaping hot metal into something useful. Life continuing as it always did, regardless of individual struggles and triumphs. In a few weeks, when Mason's strength had returned, decisions would need to be made. The offer from the Eagle Crest community would require an answer. Nell would begin her teaching position. The future so long held at bay by grief and guilt would demand attention. But for now, in this quiet room, it was enough that they had survived, not just physically, but spiritually. Enough that Clara's daughter had found the soldier with kind eyes her mother had trusted. Enough that Mason had finally confronted the ghosts that had driven him into solitude. Enough that after 12 years of darkness, light had found its way back into both their lives. The Arizona hills would continue to stand ancient and indifferent as they had for millennia before human struggles played out against their backdrop. But for Mason Reed and Eleanor Hayes, those hills would never again represent escape or hiding. Instead, they would be a reminder of justice finally served, of promises kept, and of the unexpected paths that healing sometimes takes. As the afternoon sun bathed the room in golden light, Mason found himself thinking not of the past that had haunted him for so long, but of possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. Not grand visions or detailed plans, but simple things, conversations over coffee, the satisfaction of work that mattered, perhaps even laughter shared with others who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from fragments. First steps indeed. And for the first time in 12 years, Mason Reed felt ready to take them, not alone as he had once believed was his fate, but alongside the daughter of a woman who had seen in him something worth trusting even at the end. The circle that had begun at Willow Creek was complete at last, and in its completion, a new one was just beginning.